Hi, this is Shondell Joyce, and today I'm going to demonstrate how to paint a sunset farm field. What I like about this composition is there's a golden curve. You can see how it starts with the barn and follows through with the fence. This is going to make a really beautiful painting. Before I start painting, I start with a value sketch, and in the value sketch, I use the rule of thirds to show me where the crosshairs will be, and then I make a color study to help me lay out the palette and the colors I'm going to use. These two things are very helpful, and I suggest you try them. I'm working on an old board, so I'm starting off with a piece of pumice and using it to add a little more grit to my ampersand pastel board. When you reuse a pastel surface, you'll see some of the traces of a previous painting. Using the pumice stone on top helps to add a little more tooth to the board. It also helps to lighten it. So I'm using it as like an underpainting to put a little tooth, a little grit, and to lighten up places on the board that need it. Next, I'm lightly sketching in my lines for the rule of thirds so it makes it easier for me to sketch the reference photo onto my board. I always use a light color or a color from the composition when I'm sketching the lines. That helps it to disappear. I'm starting with my darkest darks here. This is not a black. It looks like a black, but it's kind of a deep blue, like an indigo. And I'm using it to put in some of the dark in the distance. I'm going to be putting some color on top of this and making it even bluer. But for now, it helps to separate some of the layers of earth and trees from the distant mountains so that the mountains are pushed back and the trees come forward. This won't be the darkest thing in the composition, but it's going to be one of the darks. I use this to show the whole pattern of darks in the front, and in the very front I am using a pure black, but it's just the underpainting, so when all is said and done, all you're going to see is that value and not the color. I'm pushing some of the pumice in before I use some of the sky colors. In a painting like this, you really want to work in layers from the back to the front. If you started off with darks and worked towards lights, you would have a hard time blending and layering some of the distant hills on top of the sky, putting in the sky at the end. So for me, it's a little bit easier to work from the back to the front. So I'm using a cadmium yellow medium. It's a true yellow. It's not the warmest yellow I'm going to use in this composition, but it's a little warmer than the cool yellow I just put down in the background for the sky. On top of this, I'm using a cool white, which has just a slight tint of blue and gives an edge to the sky. So you get a sense of the warm light starting to overtake the sky. Then I'm using a little bit of sky blue back in there too. So now I have some strong layers up in the sky, and I'm lightly touching and blending those layers together. I don't want there to be a lot of texture up in the sky in this painting. I want the sky to be very smooth and look like it's in the distance, pushed back. So that way, when I put the tree lines and some of the mountains and hills, they'll come forward and be in the foreground. This gives a gentle, warm glow to the sky. I'm also letting that sun be diffused. It doesn't need to be a perfect circle, nor does it need to be clearly a sun. So I'm just letting it be a glowing area up in the sky. I'm also going to overlap it a bit with some yellower clouds. So this is a yellow ochre. It's warm, but it's not as intensely warm as the cadmium yellow that I put up in the sky. I'm going to go on top of it with a little bit of lavender. The lavender and the ochre neutralize each other and create a beautiful grayish neutral. This is perfect for some of those backlit clouds. Really helps to add some texture up in the sky. So notice how the clouds look like they're in the middle ground. The sky behind them very smooth and distant. Next, I am putting some more fluffy and intense clouds, still using a yellow ochre. This is one value lighter than the ochre I used before. And I am using it to create that kind of morning glow. Now, this is a transition color between the sky and the earth. It's pinkish. The earth reflects up into the sky, and this pink color is some of the hills and the farm fields reflecting up on the horizon. You see this quite often in northern climates, not so much in beach areas or places where there's a lot more water. So the pink gives it a nice glow and creates a sunset feel to the whole composition. The pink is about the same value as the yellow that I used up in the sky. The difference is, of course, the pink is a little redder and warmer. The same value yellow that's in the sky is going to be used on the grasses in the field, the golden waves. And this is really more of an underpainting. On top of it, I'm going to put some little edges of pink just to create some texture in the field and to repeat some of that pink from the sky down into the grasses. This helps create some color harmony and lead your eye through the composition. Now, this big heavy thing is a sidewalk chalk. And what I love about it is it reads as gray, but it's actually a greenish gray. So it's the perfect color for some of those trees in the middle ground. Now, this greenish gray is a neutral. It's not supposed to stand out. It's supposed to be like a backup singer to the brilliant yellows and pinks, which are the diva. We want those to steal the show. So the neutrals are really just to help give some shape and form to the landscape and the trees. And I'm using it to further increase that dark in the middle ground and create a tree line that'll help separate the field from the distant hills. This is yellow ochre. It's a value darker than the yellow ochre I used up in the sky. And this yellow ochre is going to be lighting up some of the edges on some of the trees. It's going to add some texture to those trees. They're going to look more like they're a lost edge and lighter. The yellow ochre is part of the yellow purple palette for this painting, so it's going to increase the warms. I'm also using it on the fields in the distance. I love yellow ochre. It's one of my favorite colors, and it often appears in pretty much all my paintings. So you can see how it creates an illusion of depth and perspective already just by paying attention to those values and where you place them. I'm adding some shape to those hills and the fields in the distance. I'm keeping with the same handful of colors I've been using all this time. I try not to add too much color. When I'm using a complementary palette like this, which is yellow purple, I'm going to stick to a handful of yellows, warmer and cooler versions, and a handful of purples, warmer and cooler versions, maybe a few values towards each side. Next, I'm moving into some of the darks. Now, this is more of a pronounced green. It's similar to the greenish gray, but it's a lighter, greener value. It works well for some fields that might be in the shadow of the tree line and the hills. I'm using it. It's a harder and easier to control pastel. The big sidewalk chalk size I love because you can't be perfectionistic. It's literally like painting with your elbow, as one of my friends says. When you paint with something that big, you have no control, so you can't be perfectionistic. So I often use a few pastels that are very big for sidewalks, just to keep me from being too careful. The only real architecture and architectural lines besides the fence is the small barn and house in the distance. So those need to have some hard edges. It's also a balance to the sun. So that light color on the top of the house really reflects that beautiful warm glow up in the sky. So to get that house, I'm using some harder pastels in lighter colors. Mostly what I use are NuPastels NU, which are square shaped. Occasionally I may push them with my finger or with the edge of a woodless pencil. I'm also using some of that pink to create a warm glow in the distant fields and pulling some of that greenish gray back in places where I might have painted over it. I always try to keep my values clean when I'm working and not go back and repaint over and over. It's a bad habit to get into that. It's much better to just put them down once and leave them and be conscious of them. I have yet to be able to do that. Next, I'm coming in with the same greenish color in the foreground, and this is to give some texture to the grasses. This makes them taller. I'm using linear strokes, making them shaped more like grasses, and immediately you get a sense of perspective and see how those grasses jump to the foreground while the middle ground grasses tend to push back towards the middle and the back. This is framing out that house nicely, setting it back in the field. I'm using a little bit of greenish gray, mostly to go behind some of the grasses that are going to wind up in the front. This is a transition area, so it's not too abrupt from the yellow of the field to the darker green of the foreground grasses. Keeping with the linear strokes, this helps to make sure that the grasses read as grasses and not as water reflection. I'm using some of the sky color just to highlight on some of those grasses. This is like a yellow, cadmium yellow medium. It's also a harder pastel. It's a Rembrandt. Mostly what I use are Mount Vision because they're so soft. They're like butter. Occasionally, I want a hard edge, and for those hard edges, I'll use NuPastels or Rembrandts, which give me the sharp line I'm looking for. It takes a while to be able to make a hard line with a soft pastel. If you can't do it, use the side of a NuPastel like I'm doing here and pull it straight down. You can also use a paintbrush to lift up. And here I'm using the side of the pastel to make straight lines. And this is to give perspective of the fence. So the grasses are going to be behind the fence, so I took some time and trouble to get those grasses in. I'm sighting and sight sizing to make the fence look like it goes back in space so that the second post of the fence is about half as big as the first post. It's also not near as wide. So I'm going to make it about maybe a third as wide. So sighting and sight sizing is one way to keep it in perspective. This is a split rail fence and I want to make it look like it's a handmade fence. The next railing is even further back, but it's more of a straight line. So I'm putting it closer to the second post. I'm connecting it with some split rails. And I'm going to make the line of the fence follow the line of the grasses. Next one is even closer, So we're creating the illusion of perspective. It follows the road. It curves around the grass and goes back towards the farmhouse. So now you can see a little more of the road in the distance, a little more of the fence. It's starting to make more visual sense. This is one of those places in the painting that I tend to spend more time. It's the hard edges. So I want to make sure those hard edges are clean and draw the eye and help to guide the viewer through the composition. Remember, this is the wide part of the golden curve. So I really want it to pull the eye towards the house. I'm pretty happy with the shape of the fence, pretty happy with the composition. So now I'm going to fill in the fence. I'm using some darks, using just a touch of black in the foreground on the shadow side of the fence and the posts, and this really helps to bring that fence forward. It's darker than anything else in the composition, and the darker colors come forward, lighter colors recede. I'm going to add a little more of it back into the foreground so that the grasses will appear like they're in front of the fence. It's crucial to have your darkest darks closer to the viewer and the lighter colors receding. Next, I'm using a handful of colors from the purple side. These are mostly very light purples, lavenders. You wouldn't normally look at these colors and think of them as wood green, but in this lighting and this setting, they work well as weathered wood. So I'm using a combination of lavender and red violet and a light lavender for the highlight to create the illusion of weathered wood. See how the light is striking the top of it? I'm going to put a little bit of yellow highlight on the top so that it's really catching the light and separating the fence post from the tree line. It's a backlit fence post. So it's an odd thing how purple can often read beautifully as weathered wood. It also makes a good basis for a skin tone and shadow. Purple is a really versatile color, one of my favorites as well. I'm going to use those 3 or 4 colors for pretty much all the wood. I'm keeping light logic in mind as I go. So light logic is the logical way that light wraps around objects. You can see where the sun is in this painting. So the sun is going to hit every plane on that fence that's facing the sun. So those are pretty much the backside of the fence post that we're looking at. So that whole fence is backlit. I'm making sure that the parts of the fence facing us are in shadow. So they're going to be a little darker, a little more shadowy. And here's where a lot of people make mistakes because we're afraid to go too dark. But remember, the light is on the opposite side, so you really need to be bold. In this split rail, it's facing the sky, and the sky is reflecting on that one part of the split rail. So it's lit up more than the other parts. So the sky is bluish, and that's why I used a blue color for the top. It's reflecting the light blue in the sky. This also helps to tie in that light blue so it's not concentrated only in one place, but it has more than one spot in the composition and will help move your eye through it. For the rest of the fence posts, I'm going to go a little bit darker as I go, or I'm sorry, a little lighter as I go back in space. And I'm always keeping that light logic in mind so that the light highlights on the fence hit it in the place that you would logically think they would, with it facing the sun. I'm working my way board by board and doing this whole fence one at a time. It can be a little painstaking, but it's worth it. Now you're beginning to really see the illusion take shape. This is when I start feeling good about the painting. Up until this point, paintings are in what I call the ugly stage. And that's a stage where your head may be playing tricks on you and saying, "Oh, this is awful. It's never going to come to fruition. It's never going to work out. I shouldn't have done it this way." If you hear that little voice in your head, that internal critic that Julia Cameron talks about in The Artist's Way, then you know what I mean by the ugly stage. The painting isn't really coming together. You're doubting yourself and your technique and probably your entire art career. So instead, just muscle through, ignore it, and continue. I'm pretty happy with the fence. It looks very cobbled together, and that's what I want it to look like. So I'm going to focus on the grasses. This is more of a true green. It's still a little bit cooler, a little grayer, and it's a hard pastel. It's new pastel. And I'm using it to make some tall, thin lines of grasses that overlap the fence. So the grasses are between us and the fence. So I want them to look very free and very loose and thin. So I'm going on top of them now and highlighting with a hard yellow. So this is a highlight color that's coming through the slats of the fence and lighting up some of those grasses. This is creating a lot of texture in the grasses, helping to separate a few individual strands. I certainly wouldn't want anyone to spend a lot of time painting individual strands of grass, and please don't ever make them all the same. Have some going in different directions, some curling, and so forth. This is an opportunity for mark making. And the more different you make those grasses, the more beautiful the whole painting will be. You really want to have a lot of texture in those grasses and show the hand of the artist. Now I'm just putting a few finishing touches, just a few lights here and there. Maybe some of the light from the sky in those grasses. Can't even see the black that I underpainted with. It's just a background value at this point. All of the luscious greens that are layered on top of it really help to create that illusion of perspective and grass. And at this point, pretty happy with the painting. Got my finishing touches in place. And now it's just time to sign it, slap a frame on it. If you had fun watching this demo, join me every Wednesday night for live painting classes on Zoom and paint along with me. I go a lot slower, I give instant feedback, and we talk the whole time. As an added bonus here, I'm putting in a couple of birds. You know, sometimes that painting needs a little something, something. And for me, that something is almost always a bird. In this case, I'm going to put a trio of barn swallows up in the corner. And I'm using a pencil to do this because it's a woodless graphite pencil. And it's a soft pencil and it will go right on top of the light pastel and create a good sharp edge. I love how the acrobatics of these little birds in the early morning as they're chasing bugs over the fields. I love watching them, so throwing in a trio of barn swallows just to make this painting complete, at least in my mind. This is always extra credit. I hope I'll see you online. Online classes are on my website, ShondelleJoyce.com. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.